is widely recognized as one of the West's leading authorities on the Middle East. In the wake of September 11th, the Princeton historian's views are said to have had a strong influence on George Bush and his foreign policy.
For the first 1,000 years of the 14 centuries of Islamic history, Islam was always advancing somewhere. It had its defeats, its setbacks, but these were more than compensated by other advances. From that point onwards, everything seemed to go wrong. They lost battle after battle, province after province, and found themselves outpaced and outperformed by the West, not only in the battlefield, but in the marketplace, in the schoolroom, and every other area. Now, this is reinforced by the feeling that now it is their turn and that they are again victorious. The most important single factor in that, I think, was the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. We tend to think of this as a victory of the West in the Cold War. Mm-hmm. That's not how they see it. They see it as a victory of Islam through the long, bitter struggle in Afghanistan, which ended with the retreat and defeat of the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan, and then after that, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You have been very, careful, but adamant in making the point that not all Muslims are fundamentalists, not all fundamentalists are terrorists, but that the terrorists that we are experiencing today, the Al-Qaeda, the Osama bin Laden form of terrorism, does have its roots in the basic philosophy of Islam, that the history, the philosophical underlying tenets of that religion. Explain that to us.
No, it does not have its roots in the basic philosophy of Islam. I would put it differently. Let me go back a step. We use the word Islam in two senses. We use it as the equivalent of Christianity. Mm-hmm. That's to say, a religion,
right,
in the narrow sense of the word, belief, worship, organization. We also use it as the equivalent of Christendom, meaning an entire civilization shaped by that religion, but including many elements that are not part of that religion, or may even be hostile to that religion, but nevertheless arise within this civilization. Now, one has to say that Hitler and the Nazis arose within Christendom, mm-hmm, but I don't think you could say that they arose from Christianity. This is the distinction which right. I think it's important to bear in mind. These terrorist movements certainly arise within Islamic civilization, in the same way that Hitler and the Nazis arose within Christian civilization. But that doesn't mean to say that they have their roots in basic Islamic philosophy. I would say quite the contrary.
The concept of Shi'ad is religious-based. The notion that an individual's first identity is their religion rather than their ethnic or their national identity with the Muslim world.
Yes, that is true. I mean, the idea of identity defined by ethnic or territorial nationality mm-hmm. is new in the Islamic world, and it's still very imperfectly assimilated. You can see that dramatically if you look at the map of the Middle East and North Africa. The frontiers were drawn by statesmen with rulers on maps, and mostly by English and French statesmen, not by Middle Eastern statesmen. It was the Anglo-French settlement after World War I that determined the shape of the modern Middle East, drew the frontiers. And even the identities defined by these frontiers, with few exceptions, are new inventions, imperialist inventions, if you like, with either invented names or names dredged up from antiquity. I mean, names like, shall we say, Libya, Syria, Palestine. These are names from the political geography of the Roman Empire. They had entirely disappeared during the period of Islamic rule. They reappeared with Western influence and then Western rule in the region. The names Algeria and Tunisia don't even exist in Arabic. They use the same word for the city and the country. Algiers and Algeria, Tunis and Tunisia are the same word in Arabic. I mean, this whole notion of the ethnic territorial nation is new.
Well, how about that in terms of that imperialism? I mean, there are some who say that if you really want to understand why the Muslim world has fallen behind, the West has to bear some responsibility for that, that we've currently supported repressive regimes. After World War I, the West artificially created countries for which there was no real basis, and that the British imperialism, kind of even before that, destroyed domestic economies. With the exception of Turkey and to some extent Morocco also, who have developing democracies, I guess, rather than full democracies. I mean, democracy has not flourished in the Muslim world at all. Again, what's the explanation there?
Well, the unfortunate fact is that the destruction of democracy is largely a Western achievement in the Islamic world. When they became aware that the West was more powerful, they tried to westernize, which is very natural, including westernization of government. And what this usually meant was adopting the worst Western models. Westernization did two things. It strengthened the central power by placing at the disposal of the government the whole modern apparatus of surveillance and repression, so that even a petty tyrant today has greater power than the legendary sultans and caliphs of the past. The second thing that it did was to weaken or abrogate the intermediate powers. In the traditional order, the authority of the ruler was limited by all kinds of vested interests and established groups in society.
Civil society, or the organization.
Civil society, if you like, by the urban bourgeoisie, by the country gentry, by the military establishment, the religious establishment, and so many others. This is not democracy, but it is limited responsible government. Now that was destroyed by modernization, which strengthened the government and weakened the limitations and placed, as I said, the whole modern apparatus of government at their disposal. Now the worst example of this is what we see now in Iraq. Now people talk about the government of Iraq as if that is the Arab Islamic model. That is arrant nonsense.
You've written extensively how, in fact, it doesn't resemble the traditional Islamic form of governance at all.
I mean, the roots of Saddam Hussein's regime are not to be found in the Arab past or the Islamic tradition. They come straight from Europe.
You've also drawn an interesting perspective on the role of oil and oil royalties, in fact, working against democracy in many of the Muslim countries. Explain that.
Yes, well, you know, the famous saying, no taxation without representation. Unfortunately, the converse is also true. No representation without taxation. Middle Eastern governments, in receipt of massive oil royalties, didn't need to raise taxes from their people, and therefore didn't need representative bodies to help them in assessing and collecting taxes. One of the main motivations for the development of democratic institutions was missing. And that is, I think, unfortunate, or worse than unfortunate, a tragic consequence of the oil royalties.
Your new book takes us through the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, and particularly looks at something I wasn't very familiar with at all, Wahhabism, a very extreme and militant form of Islamic thinking. Describe that to us.
Wahhabism is named after its founder, a Muslim theologian who lived in Najd, which is the northeast, the far northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, in the 18th century. He felt that Islam had become corrupt and degenerate, that the Muslims had abandoned the authentic principles of the faith as brought to them by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, and he set about what he called a cleansing of Islam. Now, this began in Najd. He succeeded in converting the rulers of the tribes of Najd, the House of Saud, the ancestors of the present Saudi royal house, and was very successful. He and they managed to establish Wahhabi doctrine in Najd, and then they tried to take it out of Najd into the rest of Arabia and even into Iraq, but they were crushed at the time. And the Ottoman Empire, although by then declining and weak, was still strong enough to deal with that. And the Wahhabi movement was crushed. It reappeared in the 20th century, this time much more successfully. And they created the Saudi Arabian kingdom, which Wahhabism was the official doctrine. Now, Wahhabism is a very extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism, totally intolerant of any degree of difference from their own view within Islam. Their hostility was directed mainly not against non-Muslims, of whom there were none in Arabia, and with whom they were not primarily concerned, but against Muslims who did not measure up to their standards. So its intolerance and repression initially was directed purely against fellow Muslims. But then two things happened which gave Wahhabism an enormous impact. One of them I just mentioned, the creation of the Saudi kingdom, which meant that the Saudi ruler now had at his disposal the resources of a kingdom, and not just any kingdom, but the one that included the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, giving him enormous prestige in the whole Muslim world, and also a control of the pilgrimage, which every year brings Muslims in their millions to visit the holy sites. This naturally gave an impact to Wahhabism, which you could not otherwise have had. The other thing was the discovery of oil and the enrichment of the Saudi establishment with these enormous revenues. So they suddenly had at their disposal a kingdom, enormous religious prestige, and unlimited funding. And they have used that to carry their message all over the Islamic world.
Now, on part of Wahhabism, or certainly that extreme point of view, you hear this from Osama bin Laden often. And in fact, I think you've gone as far as saying his real target is not the West long-term, but regimes that he sees as supportive of the West. Yes. Explain that for our viewers.
One sees this again and again. I mean, obviously, the external enemy is important for them, but the main task, yes, is the overthrow of existing regimes. And this emerges very clearly in all these fundamentalist movements. Some of them are quite explicit about it.